Good morning, everybody. It is Monday. It is going on 9 o'clock and I'm on my first break. Today I wanted to start off talking about the next book I'm going to be reading in my Stephen King reading series, which is the second book in the Dark Tower series, The Drawing of Three. Now, if you did not watch my reading vlog review of The Dark Tower, The Gunslinger, I will leave that video linked for you guys in the cards and in the description. Because in order to read this, you will need to have read that, as The Gunslinger is the first book. Now, as with many of my Stephen King reading vlogs and reviews, I will be talking about them in depth, so these will be spoiler filled. So if you've not read the books that the videos mention or are about, I would recommend you read the books before watching these videos in case you don't want to be spoiled for anything, but this will be filled with spoilery content. So, The Drawing of Three, like I said, is the second book in the Dark Tower series. Now, at the end of The Gunslinger, what we essentially went through was we learned a lot about Roland in terms of what his mission is, and he believes his mission is to go after the Man in Black and essentially the Dark Tower, which seems to be this kind of central point in a lot of issues that are happening in various worlds, more specifically his own. The Man in Black seems to have had a massive part in the destruction of Roland's home and life for some reason. We don't necessarily know what, but over the course of the book we start to learn more about Roland and kind of the way he was brought up, things about his life, and specifically some interesting people that he had lost due to unfortunate events. Over the course of the novel, we do meet this boy Jake, who Jake seems to be a very otherworldly person in the sense where he seems to be from a completely different world, just like Roland is. And we get a sense that the world that they're currently in is pretty desolate. There's not really much that there is except for deserts and mountains, and there's not much in terms of civilization, at least not in the current space that they're in. Now, what we learned at the end of The Gunslinger is that Roland basically has been putting himself on this path. He could have chosen a completely different path in terms of what he's doing, but he decides to go after the Man in Black, and the Man in Black actually tells him that if he continues on this journey to go toward the Dark Tower, he will probably die, because the Dark Tower is a very dark and desolate place, and it will pretty much suck the life out of him, especially because his obsession with the Dark Tower is kind of starting to eat away at him in a sense. And we learn that the Man in Black is not the man behind everything. If anything, he is kind of the first line of defense in terms of this dark force that is enveloped in this world. But the Dark Tower is like the main source of it, because there's even more people that come from it that are going to try to stop Roland. And the Man in Black does say that essentially in order for him to get to the Dark Tower, he has to first do a thing that's called drawing. It's some kind of magical ability. And earlier in the Gunslinger, we also had learned through an oracle that Roland had accessed that he needed to access 3 doorways in order to then access the Dark Tower, which doorways meaning it possibly to other worlds, other dimensions, things of that nature. So the Drawing of Three, my guess is him going through that entire thing. By looking at the synopsis, we'll see what this is. Taking place mere hours following the dramatic events seen in The Gunslinger, Roland of Gilead now continues on his solitary quest for the Dark Tower, leading him to a seemingly endless stretch of beach along the Western Sea, a terrain filled with unearthly monstrosities that mean certain death if he lets his guard down. But there are other mysteries along with this desolate shoreline as well. 3 arcane doorways standing freely in the sand and cryptically designed as the Prisoner, the Lady of Shadows, and the Pusher, which in actually The Gunslinger were versions of tarot cards that the Man in Black had drawn for Roland when looking at his future and what exactly his path is if he continues down the path that he's on currently. Each one is a portal to our world's New York City at different points in time, and each one is complete with its own set of dangers that could spell the end of Roland's journey. The world has moved on and the tower draws ever closer. So interesting. We're going to see New York City in 3 different time periods, which are going to essentially be what are the doorways, which I'm curious to see why that is so important. Why New York City 3 different times as opposed to just 3 different areas in the same time, or a different city in 3 different time periods? I'm curious to know as to what significance that has. And on top of that, Roland is not as familiar with kind of things that we know in our world, as evident in The Gunslinger, because Jake has a lot of words and phrases that he uses that we as people in this world would know, but Roland does not. He, for instance, in order to see the Oracle, he takes a drug that he calls mescaline, but Jake understands it as LSD, which we all understand. Now, I'm pretty sure mescaline is another name for LSD. I don't know for certain, but Roland was not familiar with that name, and there were things like a handcar on a railroad he was not familiar with. Like, that was a whole thing. Really genuinely curious to see how he's especially going to fare with seeing New York City in 3 different times. Is he gonna like understand that it's the same place in different times, that he's been like time traveling basically? Or is he going to think of them as just 3 different areas in general? Like, I don't know how that's gonna work. Basically, now what I'm gonna be doing, as opposed to what I did with the Gunslinger, because the Gunslinger was only 250 pages, I checked in about every 50 pages or so, which equated to about 5 different points of check-in. This book, though, in particular, is much more than that. This is over 500 pages. Now, this edition does not make it look like that because this is one of the pocketbooks mass market paperbacks, which they are notorious for making their books basically something you could put in like a purse or something. This particular edition is 509 pages. Yeah, 509 pages. So this I will be checking in about every 100 pages or so. However, because this is 509 pages and it would seem kind of silly for me to check in at page 500 and then read the last 9 pages, what I will do is I'll check in at the 400 page mark and then just read the rest of the book and check in at the very end of it all and let you guys know what's going on. This is going to turn into something very different than what I'm expecting, because reading The Gunslinger for the first time, again, since having listened to the audiobook and not really liking the audiobook as much, and reading it physically and enjoying it, as was evident of my last video, you're entering brand new territory for me now. So I have no idea what to expect with this one, but I'm really excited nonetheless, because I've been told that if you like The Gunslinger, you're gonna like some of these other books even more. I think there's at least one book that kind of suffers from middle book syndrome, but I'm not 100% sure what that is. But I also do have the prequel book that is coming out that's between books 4 and 5. That should be coming in Wednesday. I have to try to get back to work. My internet's been being very fickle today because it's been raining, and when it rains here at my parents' house, the internet goes berserk. It doesn't seem to work. So we're gonna see if we can actually get some work done today at work, provided the internet works with me, or if the rain stops at some point. So yeah, I will check in with you guys once I've reached about the 100-page mark, which for this edition will be around page, let's see, page 103. So be a good chunk of the way through. Hi guys, so I'm very sorry. It's been now probably almost 2 weeks since I've updated you guys, but I finally got through the first 100 pages of The Drawing of Three. The last couple weeks have just been really busy for me, and I wouldn't say I've necessarily been in a slump per se, but I've been just not in the best mood to read all the time. But I did finally get through more of this today. I've actually read more today than I think I have in a couple weeks, because I've also been reading this and then another book through audio. Let's basically go over the last 100 pages. So basically we pick up right after the events of the Gunslinger, and basically Roland is in this kind of beachy area. It's the Western Sea, I think is what it's called, and unfortunately very early on he gets injured gravely, where like these, what he calls lobstrum monstrosities, something like that, basically giant freaking lobsters, attack him and cause him to lose at least 1 toe and then 2 fingers on his hand, and it basically makes him crippled. He's not really able to do much, and through this time he's kind of still trying to learn about what exactly it is the Man in Black wants him to do. Also, I'm sorry if I sound winded or I have to like catch my breath at any time, because the house has been without air conditioning now for about 2 days, and it's been really hot here in Michigan, so we are struggling. But the day I'm actually filming this clip, we have somebody that's actually coming out and fixing it, after having been told that we would have to wait until Monday. So yeah, Roland does come across one of the 3 doors he was told about in The Gunslinger that he was going to come across. Now, he doesn't know what these doors are for. He doesn't know what his purpose is with these doors. He just finds one, and we get into the perspective of another character and kind of like heading to New York City. It's more based in the real world, named for a guy named Eddie Dean. Eddie is unfortunately going through a lot of his own stuff. What you learn over the course of Roland peering through Eddie's eyes and being able to read his mind and things like that through this door is that Eddie is a drug smuggler. He's been smuggling cocaine. He's also a heroin addict, which is like I thought, an allusion to the fact that the Man in Black in The Gunslinger talked about how there was this demon heroin in terms of the fact that it was affecting somebody that Roland was going to come across through one of these doors. And Roland has basically just helped Eddie get through this whole endeavor where he was flying on a plane to New York City. He was going to get caught with the cocaine because people were thinking that he was acting kind of funny, so they thought either he was a terrorist or he was smuggling drugs. And so Roland helps him get through all of that by basically through the door letting Eddie through, having him meet Eddie in the flesh and blood for the first time, and taking the cocaine so that Eddie can go back through the door back to the real world, or his world at the very least, and end up, you know, being without the cocaine. And he's been interrogated by the customs police and everything, and so we just basically come off of that. That's basically all that happens in the first 100 pages. The majority of it being in Eddie's head and learning about him and the fact that he's a drug smuggler and he's addicted to heroin, and he is basically involved in something with his brother. You learn that the way he got into the smuggling business is through his older brother, who either they've been doing it for a long time, or at least his older brother has, and gets Eddie involved. And essentially he is going to New York to meet somebody to give this cocaine to, which I think is supposed to basically give him the opportunity to get more heroin. I don't know necessarily. There's some kind of deal going on is all I can really say. And it does involve Eddie's older brother, Henry. Now, in terms of, is Roland still a part of all this? Yes, he is still seeing everything from Eddie's perspective. This is one of the doors that I believe is kind of in the synopsis, where it talks about how he sees 3 different points of time in New York City. Eddie is our first person. They don't say necessarily what the time period is of this, whether it's in the 1980s when this was published, or if it's a future time or whatever. But what's really interesting is over the course of all of this, Roland is starting to pick up on a lot of the differences between his life and the world that Eddie lives in, because Eddie seems to live more in our world, where like we know what things are, like airplanes, we know what a tuna sandwich is. And it's so funny because Roland doesn't quite understand it. They're not things that he knows. It's almost as if he, you know, to a outside perspective, he's from a foreign country, but he's actually from like a completely different universe, like a different timeline of some kind. So he doesn't know what any of this stuff is. He has no idea what a tuna sandwich is. He calls it a, what does he call it? A Tudor sandwich, something like that. But he relates it to what his world would have called something like that, because he's able to at least understand the context of certain situations. I gotta look this up because now I'm trying to remember how he calls it. Yeah, he calls it a Tudor fish popkin, and popkins were, I guess, some kind of a sandwich in his world, and he thinks that they're saying Tudor fish as opposed to tuna fish. It's just, it's really funny. Like, there's some very small things that, you know, make you giggle, because seeing this from a specifically a non-American perspective, you know, this is something that most people like that come to America would be like, yeah, I didn't know that that's what it was called. And to us Americans, it is kind of funny in a sense, because people who are foreign might say things that don't sound quite right or aren't necessarily the way we would say them. But to me, it's always just interesting, specifically because Roland's not even from this universe. He has completely lost. He doesn't even really get any contextual clues. He's literally building context as he can based on his own life, which I guess is pretty synonymous with that of like a foreign individual, which I guess in a sense he is. I don't know, it's just really funny to me to see him try to figure out what all this stuff is in the course of helping Eddie and trying to figure out, you know, what's going on and why he's seeing things through Eddie's perspective. He basically only knows, though, that he does have to help Eddie and that Eddie is important in his journey in some capacity. So that's pretty much the first 100 pages. I'm on page 103 now. We just went through the first section of chapter 4, which is called The Tower. The next 100 pages is going to basically get us into the second full part of this book, because just like with The Gunslinger, there's several parts, which include several chapters, which include several parts of chapters. It's still very similar in terms of the structure. But by the time I hit the 200 page mark, it will have been well into the second, at least the second full part. I could be wrong. There could be a whole other part that is somewhere wedged in between these that I'm gonna miss or that I haven't seen come up yet. So we will end up getting to page 208. and let's see, 224, I think. And then we'll hit a part called The Lady of Shadows, which I think is going to be that female character that was going to come in on wheels that was talked about in the first book. So far what I can tell is it's very synonymous in terms of the writing style. Everything seems to be fairly similar with the first book. I'm not having really any issues. I feel like though with this one I'm grasping the story a little bit better than I was with the gunslinger. I don't know why. Mostly I think because we spent so much time with a much more present setting in a more relatable setting in a sense, that I think that that's been making it a lot easier, as opposed to how the gunslinger seemed to be in a completely different world and having to piece a lot of stuff together in terms of specifically hunting down the man in black. Now it's basically Roland is almost as if he's in a foreign country and he's like trying to figure out what the heck's even going on. So, I mean, that seems to make it a lot easier at least. I'll check back in with you guys again once I've reached that 224 page mark, and we'll talk about what specifically happens now, continuing on with Eddie and Roland at this point in time. I don't know if we're going to spend a lot more time with Eddie. I have a feeling that once we get at least to maybe the Lady of Shadows, my thought is if we haven't already left Eddie, we will be leaving him and moving on to another point in time in New York City, whether that's in the future, in the past, or I don't even quite know. Again, I don't even know exactly when this part with Eddie is, whether it's supposed to be in the present, whereas like it would be in the future. The present of this would be 1987, so because that's when this book was published. So my thought is it's supposed to be then, but I don't know for sure because they don't ever really give you contextual clues, so that's just my assumption. Also, by the time I get to that point, hopefully the air will be fixed in this house and I won't feel like I'm dying slightly on the inside and on the outside. Okay guys, so it's a couple days later. Sorry if I have to at some point in this clip change out my battery and the angle changes. It's just because my battery is really low. So first off, I did get my hair cut. I also just got my nose pierced yesterday, for those of you that are interested in my day-to-day life. A lot of stuff has changed in the last few days. What's also happened is we've reached over 200 pages of this book. So let me go through a little bit about what happened. So as I told you guys before, we basically had got really cemented in with this character, Eddie Dean, who is a heroin addict who is basically trying to move cocaine through the states, and it's a way for him to be able to pay a debt in a sense to obtain heroin. And what I last left you guys off on, I think, was him getting out of the entire questioning, interrogation from the airline and from Homeland Security, all that stuff. So basically what happens immediately after is he leaves in a cab and he's constantly looking over his shoulder, and because we realize that the people from the airline and like the government are trying to basically track him to prove the fact that he hid that stuff somewhere and that he is like a bad guy. So he feels like he's being tailed, and then essentially what happens later is that after having fed the gunslinger, after feeding Roland, which Roland experiences his first hot dogs, which is interesting, and his first drink of Pepsi, also very interesting to read from his perspective. Eddie gets basically confronted with some cronies of this guy named Balazar. Balazar is the man that is kind of the I don't know if he's necessarily a kingpin of any kind, but he is the guy that Eddie was hired to move this cocaine for. And so he gets taken in, and we find out that unfortunately his older brother Henry, who was captured in order to kind of entice Eddie to get this job done, they try to push more heroin on him to subdue him, and unfortunately Henry does die. What happens from there is you start seeing things from the other perspectives of some of the guys that are involved with Balazar and get their ideas of what's going on, and you learn that Balazar has kind of some little quirks and things that kind of can, you know, be as tells for these cronies. So Eddie ends up getting taken to Balazar, and Balazar is basically trying to figure out where this cocaine went, because he knows that Eddie must have hid it somewhere, but he doesn't know where, and he kind of is trying to intimidate him into telling him where the cocaine is hidden, and Eddie's not letting up. And then basically from there, we spend quite a bit of time going through a whole shootout, because Eddie gets really invigorated to get rid of Balazar. He wants to like kill him. He wants to basically stop this stuff from happening anymore. And then when he finds out that his brother has been killed, that he kind of intensifies everything. He becomes really kind of manic in a sense where he just goes completely berserk and kills everybody with the help of Roland. He does actually end up going over to the other side of Roland's door in a way to basically grab one of the cronies and toss him in there and essentially kill him there so that Balazar doesn't hear anything happen. And then like basically from there, that's where the shootout starts. But Roland then comes from the other side, comes over to Eddie's side of New York and helps him with killing off everybody. It's a big shootout. There's not really much to say in terms of that. Just a lot of gunfire and death and blood, and Eddie does basically go berserk. So when that happens, the police are basically on their way, and so then Roland's like, I need you to come to the other side. You are actually supposed to come help me with something anyway, and I really need you, and we need to protect you from this government that's coming to get you because you've killed a bunch of people. Like, you will be going away forever, and your brother's no longer here anyway, so there's nothing we can do. Come to the other side with me. So Eddie does, and then he gets a taste of the lobster creatures that basically had taken two of Roland's fingers and one of his toes. From there, basically all that happens is Eddie and Roland start going down the beach. They start heading in one direction towards where they think the Dark Tower is going to be, and they travel for days. And Roland at this time had been really getting sick because of the fact that he had basically been infected with the lobster monster's kind of poison. The fact that he had lost two fingers and a toe, like those were starting to get infected. And so he was basically dying. And what Eddie ends up being able to do is almost in a sense reviving him by essentially killing the lobster creatures and having Roland eat the meat. And Roland gets freaked out by that at first. He's like, those things are poisonous. Don't you know that you can't eat those things? And it turns out you can, because Eddie kind of compares it to when you eat rattlesnake. Rattlesnakes are poisonous, but if you kill them and you cook them, you know, they're good sources of protein. And that's kind of what these lobster creatures are, is a good source of protein for Roland. And with that, he's able to actually generate a little bit. His energy's able to get back up. He's feeling a lot better. And over the course of this entire thing too, we get to a point where Eddie actually goes back and starts talking about how exactly he got to where he is, because his older brother was really involved with a lot of the reason as to like how he got involved with heroin. And he goes specifically into it, where his older brother essentially, because they were from a single mother household, his brother was the one that took care of him most of his life. Henry was a really smart kid. He was not really super athletic, but he didn't do anything with sports, and he pretty much failed school a lot because he spent so much time taking care of his brother. He didn't fail school because he was an idiot. He just couldn't get his assignments and stuff done because he spent so much time taking care of his brother. And so in order for him to make any kind of a living out after high school, because he couldn't get into college, and mostly because they couldn't afford it, because he didn't do well enough to get any kind of scholarships, Henry basically goes to war in Vietnam, and he blows out his knee. Like, it ends up being a really awful thing. And when he's going through like rehab, they put him through a very heavy morphine-based prescription basically, and they start to wean him off of it. But at some point, it doesn't get weaned off enough, because when Henry comes back, he's starting to snort the heroin, and Eddie comes in and sees him doing this. And Eddie talks about at first how he was really upset with Henry, how they yelled at each other, they screamed at each other, and Henry was like, yeah, I get it. I'm a bad influence. I can't be here anymore. I'll just go because you don't deserve this. And because Henry is really remorseful of the fact that this is what he's been doing. It's just the fact that because he's in so much pain, it feels like he can't think of anything else to do, which is a lot of times the case with some drug addicts. But eventually they make up, and Eddie actually starts snorting it with him after some time. And then eventually that progresses to Henry then shooting up heroin, which, if you don't know what the term means, shooting up basically means taking a needle of the drug and injecting it into your veins, which is usually the way that I hear about heroin. I've heard before of like snorting heroin as like a powder like you would with cocaine, but more often than not, when you hear about heroin, you hear about injecting it into your veins, because a lot of people, especially when they get involved with morphine-based drugs, like if they go through surgery and are on painkillers and stuff like that, that is the modus operandi of the drug that is the best way to get the most intense high, and it knocks you out forever. Like, it is one of the hardest drugs to get off of, because the intensity of the drug itself on the body is unfathomable to any other drug that there is out there. It essentially, from what I understand, is a drug that lays you out flat for hours, possibly even days. And it's also why a lot of people end up dying from it, because sometimes they unintentionally overdose, or they essentially will start vomiting and they can't move. They can't actually get up and vomit like into a trash can or into a toilet, because their bodies are basically letting down with the drug, and essentially they choke on their own vomit. And Henry obviously like I said, he starts using this, and Eddie gets really mad at him again, but then eventually they make up again and he starts doing it as well. And that kind of basically is what got him involved with Balazar and all this other stuff. Roland says basically that's just kind of how it is. Unfortunately, that's just kind of what is meant to be. And Eddie's like kind of upset because he thinks that Roland would have something better to say, but Roland's just like, you know, that's life. It's kind of how life is. All that happens after that, because my battery's gonna die here in a second, all that happens after that basically is they find the second door for the Lady of the Shadows, and we are going to see what this Lady of the Shadows is involved in. So I'll check back in around 300 pages. Hey guys, so it's a couple days later, back home. I don't think I said this in the last clip, but I was actually away from home for a couple of days. I was still working while I was gone, but I basically was like out of town. But anyway, back home now, and we've just reached the 304 page mark. So the last 100 pages, like I had told you guys before, we were going to be getting into the Lady of the Shadows, who is our second person that Roland has to basically draw to him that is going to help him on this journey. And we learn very quickly that the woman involved, her name is Odetta, but Odetta is not just Odetta. So for those of you that don't know, there is a disorder within the mental health realm called dissociative identity disorder. It used to be called multiple personality disorder, or sometimes is called split personality disorder. And it basically is when an individual, usually at a very young age, suffers from severe trauma, usually over the course of a couple of years in a very formative time, usually I think between the ages of like 5 to 8. And essentially what happens is that the child is not able to solidify a single personality, because the trauma they endure causes them to have to almost split their attention in terms of the fact that they have to almost remove themselves from their own minds in order to deal with the trauma, which is where the idea of split comes in, or multiple comes in, because instead of there being only one major personality that is found in most quote-unquote normal humans, this individual will usually have at least 2, sometimes more, depending on how severe their trauma is and how severe the splitting of the personalities becomes over the course of time. Now, this is a very lackluster kind of developed and researched disorder, because a lot of times it can be seen as somebody being more of a compulsive liar in terms of how they experience things, or it's just a very kind of less believable disorder for a lot of people, because there's a lot of stigma around it. Basically, this disorder is a very lackluster, like I said, kind of disorder in terms of documentation and representation. For instance, a lot of movies and TV shows that involve characters, especially in crime-based stuff, where they involve characters who have this multiple personality disorder, it's very demonizing, because they talk about how they are very violent and how sometimes the alters or the other personalities involved in the individual are violent and dangerous. Now, this only accounts for so few of the actual people with DID. The thing is that the idea is that the alter that is violent in a sense that it is trying to protect the individual more often than not. I'll leave a few people down in the description for you guys to check this stuff out. It's actually really interesting in terms of listen to these people specifically that have vetted dissociative identity disorder and really kind of talking about their experience. There's actually a booktuber who I know has suffered with it for most of their life. They are called the Starlight System, I believe, something along those lines. I'll leave their link down in the description for you, because they are really putting out a lot of content in terms of talking about their system and the way that they handle things, and especially with having a partner involved. The partner of this system actually is very helpful in talking about the way that it is in terms of day-to-day life and day-to-day functions with this system kind of thing. But anyway, so the character that we know as the Lady of the Shadows is basically a person with DID. Now, keeping in mind, this goes actually back in time to 1964. Basically, she's a black woman who is actually fairly wealthy. She comes from a very well-to-do family in New York in the 1960s, and she would at that time be diagnosed actually with schizophrenia, because back then this was still a very rare disorder. It is still a very rare disorder, don't get me wrong, but even back then it was much more rare. And so especially with this entire setup where she's from a wealthy family, you know, she's kind of came into money, all these things, it doesn't seem like anything would normally be wrong with her. But she has this schizophrenia, which back then was because they did believe that there were just voices in these people's heads as opposed to there being distinct personality differences. And this woman doesn't know she has essentially DID. And the other personality she has is named Detta. Now, what we learn through the first part of this, in the first about 20 to 30 pages basically, because keep in mind this did start on about 220 something because the chapter beforehand was a little bit longer than the 200 page mark. But for the first, I would say 20 to 30 pages of this, we learn a lot about Odetta and Detta and how they're very different. Odetta has been through a lot in terms of her life. We start to see that there are some things that could have contributed to her disorder in terms of the abuse that she had gone through as a kid, but she also had just gotten back from some very traumatic thing in Oxford, Mississippi that we don't really know much about. We do know that it was very traumatic and has kind of been a catalyst in really bringing up the other personality of Detta, who Detta is a little bit more violent. You have Odetta, who's kind of your more prim and proper woman because she came up and grew up with money, and then you have Detta, who kind of is like the antithesis of that, we'll say. Detta is very much someone who believes she is still kind of on the streets, that she's kind of from the streets, that kind of a thing. And so you just see the very distinct personalities. Now, we see that there are people that are involved in Odetta's life that, you know, are questioning what's going on with her, because when she tends to have migraines, she tends to disappear for several days, which brings basically on the switch between Odetta and Detta. You see that Detta has like a whole other, you know, life set up, and people don't know where Odetta goes. They don't know like what happens to her within the few days that usually Detta has taken over. And there is a point in time where Odetta gets thrown or pushed basically in front of a train and gets hurt, like, but loses the ability to walk again. And at one point, after being released from the hospital, basically goes to shoplift because of a switch that had happened to Detta. And when that happens, Roland ends up stepping in and actually bringing her into his world where he and Eddie already are. And they had basically been watching this whole thing between Odetta and Detta and understanding that there is some very dark aspect about this woman that they are kind of afraid of, but they know that she is important, and so they need to bring her to this other side. And then basically from there, I believe it's Odetta in the seat basically when it comes to the interactions she has, but she comes over, doesn't remember what happened, doesn't know exactly who she is, where she is, if she's dreaming, if she's in a coma, you know, whatever it is. She's very confused at what happens, and she starts to talk to Eddie and starts to basically talk a little bit about her upbringing, where she talks about when she was a little kid, her aunt had gotten married, and after the wedding, her parents had decided to take her to New York City for about a week. And when they were walking down the sidewalk, a brick fell, and they don't know whether it was purely an accident or if there was something involved in terms of it being a hate crime attack, but a brick fell and hit Odetta on the head, causing her to be in a coma. And what it seems to me is that could have possibly been the way that this DID idea could have come in. I'm not 100% sure if that's really what we're saying here in this, but that seems to be possibly the case because we just don't know whether or not Detta has been starting to come around since that accident. But we do know that Odetta at least starts talking again about how she does remember something else happening in Oxford, but she doesn't want to say what happened because I think she almost doesn't want to admit what happened, whether that was she was assaulted, whether that was sexually or just physically. You know, like there's a lot of stuff that's going on in this that we don't really have a lot of answers for as of yet. Kind of like how we had with Eddie, where with Eddie we started to learn things as the story had gone on and he had talked to Roland. Odetta is not really that keen on Roland right now. He is very much intimidating to her. She doesn't know what to do with him. She doesn't know if she can trust him, but she's starting to kind of create a kind of relationship with Eddie, which Eddie is really funny with this, because when they meet Odetta was, like, the time she was living in 1964, that was the year that Eddie was born. What's really funny is the interactions between the two of them in terms of slang, and how Eddie's things of slang Odetta doesn't know yet because they haven't been around yet, and then some things that she says in terms of slang he has no idea about because it's from a completely older time period, which is pretty much the case. I mean, if I think about some of the slang terms that have come around in the last couple of years, I know for a fact that they only just came around in the last couple of years, because they weren't things that my generation was saying at all, like when we were in high school and stuff. Like, even in just the last 6-7 years that I've been out of high school, the amount of slang that has come around since then is mind-boggling, because I can't even imagine how that would have, you know, become applied into my life when I was in high school. It just wouldn't have, like, everyone, if I was to go back in a time machine and tell everybody, you know, back then the slang that was involved, they would be looking at me really funny, like, who are you? Where are you from? Kind of thing. The one thing I do want to mention, though, too, that I tended to notice more so in this book than I think I have with The Gunslinger, and you guys are going to have to tell me whether or not this is true, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe in The Gunslinger we learn anything about necessarily the race or ethnicity of Roland. And the reason I say this is because a couple of times already in this book, when it comes to specifically with Odetta and, like, learning about Odetta, we learned that Roland could possibly be white or some kind of fair-skinned individual. Whether or not they call it white where he's from, I don't know. But the way that they talk about Odetta compared to him basically indicates to me that he is something like a white person, which I don't believe is ever brought up in The Gunslinger, which I think is the reason why they used Idris Elba as the character in the movie with Matthew McConaughey as the Man in Black. I truthfully do not know off of the top of my head if they ever mention it, because it's kind of one of those things where I went into that book with the mindset of having Idris Elba as my Roland because I knew he had played him in the movie. So I've been sitting here thinking this entire time that Roland's a black man, all these things, but the more that I read this, I'm starting to see that I think that he might actually be white, and I don't remember if that was actually the case in The Gunslinger now. We are now well into this third part. We're currently in the chapter 2 section of The Lady of Shadows. There is a whole other chapter. There's chapter 4, and then we're going to go into the next part, which is called Reshuffle. And I think this is basically going to be, again, kind of an interim period. Like the last time when Eddie had come around, we finished off his part, and then there was a whole shuffle part where it basically was just kind of an interim leading up to The Lady of Shadows. And then this, I think, is going to be kind of the same with that before we get into the last part, which is bringing in our next character, which will be the Pusher. I'll be coming back basically on page 400 when we've just kind of got started with the Pusher. I'm a little concerned because Detta does seem like somebody who would be a little bit more of a loose cannon than I think they would like, but I don't know. We'll see. So far, actually, it's not too bad. I like it a lot. I feel like there's some really interesting things going on here in terms of, like, specifically the DID thing. I wouldn't say it's necessarily being demonized, but again, this is a disorder that even in the 1980s when this was published wasn't a really well looked into disorder. It was kind of still seen as schizophrenic until I think the 1990s, my mom said. We had a whole discussion about DID and the representation of it and the issues surrounding around being diagnosed with DID, because she's a social worker and specifically deals with kids that have behavioral issues which can extend to things like OCD, anxiety, depression, personality disorders, that kind of thing. So she knows a lot more about this topic, and we had like a full-on conversation about the aspect of this in terms of the time periods that this was involved in. I think that up until the 1990s, DID was basically considered schizophrenia. So I will say that is a big thing to note when it comes to reading this, is that this is written in a different time period, so the representation of mental illnesses is going to be very different, because especially with this particular mental illness, it wasn't well looked into. And I wouldn't say this is being used as like some kind of a plot twist of any kind that she has this. It's basically told right off the bat at the beginning of her section that she has this, so you go into it knowing that there's going to be something really different about this character. But as far as it's using as a plot point or like a character point kind of thing, I don't know how this is going to help or hinder them, but I also have no idea how Eddie's whole heroin addiction thing is going to help or hinder him in terms of like what their purpose is with going with Roland to the Dark Tower. Like, we still have no idea why these people are coming together. They're just people that Roland is supposed to meet and bring to him and take with him on his journey. We still have no clue whether or not they're actually going to be useful, which I'm not going to say concerned about, but a little confused on. And I think that's because it's just going to have to be something that's going to be drawn out, and hopefully these three characters end up staying alive, because knowing how things ended for Jake and the Gunslinger, I genuinely hope these ones actually get to hang around a little bit longer than he did. Okay, so it is the next day, and I have just reached page 400, so let's go over the last about 100 pages or so that I have read. Okay, so for the majority of the last of the part that we were in, which was about the Lady of the Shadows, basically what Eddie and Roland are doing is trying to basically traverse this beach still with Odetta / Detta, and they're finding that Detta is right now in control of the body. She is kind of unrelenting. She keeps trying to attack Eddie and Roland. She keeps trying to sabotage their journey, all these things, because she's just raving mad, basically. And the whole thing is that, you know, she keeps like stumbling them, making it so that they can't move her in her wheelchair down the beach, and it's making them very frustrated, all these things. And then we get into the next part, which is called Reshuffle, and basically from here you start to learn that, like, I think even a little bit beforehand, that Eddie is like falling in love with Odetta, because when she first came over to this beach, Odetta was in the body, and Eddie started to fall in love with her very quickly because, for God knows why, I don't really understand it either. But then when Detta takes over, he understands that, like, this woman is very dangerous. So basically, Roland and Eddie and Odetta / Detta, they keep having to go down the beach, trying to find the third door, all these things. They don't really know what exactly to do with all of this. There does come a point where Roland has to actually basically be left behind, because Roland has been, through the entirety of this book, pretty much been very sick. He's been getting worse. He had started to get a little bit better after having been able to eat, and then when Odetta comes along, he starts to actually regress back to being unable to even walk. So Eddie takes Odetta further on down. They try to find the door. And so then Odetta's personality fronts at this point, because again, this is a character who basically has dissociative identity disorder, and when a personality takes over, it's called a front. So Odetta starts to front, and she's not still aware that there's really another personality involved. Eddie doesn't really seem to be the one that wants to tell her, nor does Roland. They just kind of let it happen. Eddie starts to kind of continue to build this relationship with Odetta, and at one point they have sex, basically, wake up, he leaves her so that he can go back and get Roland, and basically leaves her kind of up on this hillside that's like off the beach, so that he can go back with the wheelchair that she had and get Roland, bring him back to where they are, because they do end up finding the door shortly thereafter. Then from there, what happens is Roland kind of gets upset, because not only does he leave Odetta, but Eddie ends up actually leaving Roland's second gun with Odetta, which Roland was like, don't do that, because if Detta comes back into this body, she is going to use that against us, and it's just not a good idea to leave her with this gun, even if, you know, the bullets might not work necessarily, because we've learned since Eddie came over that the bullets in the gun stopped working after a time because they got wet. And they get back there, Roland and Eddie do, and Detta is nowhere to be found, but you learn that Detta has fronted and while Eddie was gone, and she is hell-bent on using that gun. She's watching them. She's kind of plotting her own way of killing them or attacking them or something like that. And so then what Roland has Eddie do is he gives Eddie his other gun and is like, I need you to go find her and, you know, be on your guard. Like, don't let her get in your head, you know, all these things. And Roland then decides to go through the third door, which is for the pusher. Now, when they find the door, Roland thought that this door was going to be in terms of something that's going to relate to death, because when he had talked to the Man in Black in the first book, and there was a tarot cards shuffle that basically was laying out his journey. There was the prisoner, which was Eddie. There was the Lady of the Shadows, which was Odetta/Detta. And then he said that there was going to be an element of death, but not for Roland involved. And there was going to be this pusher involved, which this is what this door is for the pusher. And very beginning of that part, which is the pusher, Roland goes through the door and we start to see this whole thing. He enters the door, which enters the mind of the pusher, whose name is Jack Mort. Now, what we learn very quickly is Jack Mort is actually the guy who pushed Jake in the road, which then caused Jake to die in his world and then come into Roland's world, which, if you don't know anything about what that means, so in the first book, when we meet Jake, who is a young boy, he's about 13 years old, I would say, he talks to Roland about how he doesn't remember what exactly happened to get him to where he is now, but he does remember having been hit by a car on his way to school. And he says that he doesn't really know what exactly happened. He doesn't know if he was pushed, he doesn't know if he just fell or whatever, but he does end up getting hit by a car, and the next thing he knows, he wakes up basically in Roland's world, and he's at the way station where Roland finds him, and then starts the whole journey with Jake and the unfortunate death of him later on. So we learned that Jack Mort is the man who did supposedly push Jake into the road, and Roland starts to think that maybe necessarily that this man is not death, but that Roland is death, which I'm still not necessarily certain what that means. So as I said before, this book is about 510 pages, so the next time I come to you guys will be when I have finished the book, because I'd rather finish the 110 pages than come back after 100 pages and then have 10 more pages left to read. That doesn't make any sense to me. I will talk to you guys again once we've finished the drawing of the three. Okay guys, please excuse the poor lighting. The lighting in the bedrooms of my parents' house are not the best, and even with the window open, it's raining, so I hope that this is sufficient. But I have now finished The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King, the second book in the Dark Tower series. So let's go over what happened in the last 110 pages. We do learn throughout this 110 pages that basically the time period that Jack is in is pretty much 3 years after Odetta gets tossed into the train station, into like the train tracks, and loses both of her legs, because Jack was the one who did it. Jack was the one who pushed her into the train tracks and she lost her legs. And when all this stuff is happening, it's like 3 years later. So this is like probably late 60s, early 70s, basically, is the kind of the time area. So Roland basically goes through and learns about Jack, who basically is just a bit of a dickhead. The way that he goes about his normal life in order to kind of feel satiated is by pushing people into like mortal danger through getting hit by cars or trains or whatever. Like, he likes to put people in a position where they could actually be seriously hurt. And you find out also later that Jack was also the one who dropped the brick on Odetta when she was a little girl. The brick that basically put her in a comatose state, which likely what could have caused the first possible splitting of her personality. It's not indicated whether that's true or not, but it's a possibility considering it was a very tragic accident and she was in a coma for several days, I think. So he not only was the one who inevitably pushed her into the train tracks, but he also was the one that dropped the brick on her head, and he has no remorse for it whatsoever. So basically what happens from here is Roland has to get Jack to get ammunition and stuff in order to send it back through the door with Roland. He's basically using Jack as kind of a puppet. He uses his brain and Jack's brain knowing basically of like how the world is, what certain things are called. He's using Jack as a way to traverse this world in order to obtain things like guns, bullets, medicine, stuff like that. The stuff he actually needs in order to survive on the other side of the door. And whether or not Jack comes along with all of that, we don't know at this point. We go into chapter 2, which is called The Honey Pot, where basically this is split up a little bit between Eddie having to find Detta, because as I said before, Detta basically had taken over the body once again, and she has stolen one of Roland's gun and is out hiding, looking to capture either Eddie or Roland and torture them basically, because she's a very defensive person. She thinks that if I don't get them, they're gonna get me, so I need to get them first. The first couple parts of that are dealing with the two of them and how she's plotting and what she's planning on doing in terms of like capturing them. And unfortunately, she does capture Eddie very quickly. He's not the smartest of guys when it comes to like how to track things, but Detta does end up capturing him and basically putting him in this like thing where she ties a noose around his neck and then ties his hands and his legs behind them, but connects it all to the noose. So if basically either his hands or his legs in this position, like since he's laying on his stomach, if either of those end up dropping at any point, he's basically going to strangle himself. And she places him also like on the beach where all of these lobster monstrosities are going to come in at dusk and be looking for food. And so she knows that if she leaves him there, they're going to go right for him and they're going to try to like kill him. And that's kind of her plan. So then we go into chapter 3, which is Roland takes his medicine, and this is where we get into the whole thing about Jack ending up basically helping Roland with obtaining the things he needs. So Roland gets Jack to traverse New York City and head to basically this gun store, and he is trying to find a type of bullet that's going to work with the guns that he already has. The kind of gun he has is very similar to ones that are in this world where Eddie, Detta, Odetta, and Jack are from, and he figures it out, finds out that he needs like a specific card, a permit basically to have these bullets. Doesn't really seem to have it, so he kind of basically creates this big kerfuffle in order to get what he wants by basically placing his wallet on the other side of the counter to show that this guy had stolen his wallet. The store owner goes out to the police that are outside, tells them that he's stolen their wallet, and apparently this guy already had a bit of a rap sheet and they were looking to, you know, track him down the best he could and bring him in on basically anything and pin him on like on a bunch of stuff that might involve like the mafia. And so the police go in, they really like get involved with it. Roland then, still as Jack, basically like attacks the cops. He bashes their heads together so they're knocked out and starts to intimidate the gun store owner, and essentially is able to get the bullets and stuff and pay for them, just not with the permit that he needs. But he pays for them and then he leaves, and before he leaves though, he asks the gun store owner where the nearest drugstore is basically, because Roland is still also very sick at this point and he needs drugs in order to like actually fight off this infection he's been having. He was fighting Balazar with Eddie. He had grabbed what's called Keflex. He basically had run out by this point, so he asked the gun store owner where the nearest drugstore is so he can go get some more. And you go to the drugstore with him. He basically intimidates the salespeople there into giving him the Keflex, and instead of like just completely robbing them, he decides to drop off Jack's $6,500 watch with them instead, because he's like, I'm not gonna not pay for this, but I need you to give me what I want with no questions asked. The cops are after him. They know that it's Jack. They know that Jack may have been doing some kind of shady stuff. So they go after him and they start shooting the body, which that's a bad thing for Roland, because if Jack dies, then it's likely that Roland will die as well, because he's not going to be able to get any of the stuff he needs over the door. This is going into chapter 4, the drawing. He gets Jack to basically put the bullets that he's bought and all the Keflex that he's gotten and put them in his underwear. And somehow this is going to basically get over to the door. But then what Roland does is have Jack jump in front of a train that is coming, which ends up killing Jack, but gets Roland back across the door. And what happens in that time too is that as Jack is getting ready to jump in front of the train, there's this moment where the door opens and Detta/Odetta is able to look inside the door. And there's this weird thing that happens where instead of Jack coming over basically physically, there's this really weird shift that happens where not only does Odetta and Detta's personalities fuse, but there's even a third personality that comes in that we learn later is named Susanna, which, if you know anything about the rest of the series, there is a book later on in the series, I think it's book 6, that's called Song of Susanna. So I have a distinct feeling that that book's going to be really important when it comes to Susanna. Or Odetta, basically, is what I'm going to continue to call her. So from that point, when Roland is back over to the other side, everything seems to be going pretty okay, actually. Now that Susanna or Odetta, you know, is kind of more stable, they're able to do basically a lot of stuff. They're able to save Eddie, who's already been being attacked by the lobster monstrosities. He's like being hurt by that. So they save him, and then you learn about basically what's been going on with Odetta. Basically, they talk about how she almost was turned inside out the first time when she was brought over from the door, which caused her to understand she had possibly these two personalities. She just wasn't willing to admit it. And then with Jack coming over through the door and basically fusing these two personalities together, she became whole again. One personality, one person in general. But that person is now going by the name of Susanna Dean. And basically that personality is quite funny because she's got a really interesting combination of both Detta and Odetta's personalities, because right off the bat after that, she takes the guns and starts killing the lobster monstrosities, and she's using the phrasing and the sentence structure that Detta would use. But you see as the rest of the story goes on that she's still got a lot of Odetta in her, and that, you know, that personality seems to be taking the front more, but she's still one whole person now, just under the name of a different person. Then we move into the final part, which is only about 10 pages or so, which is called The Final Shuffle. Now, this is basically just a kind of epilogue, if anything else, because we see that immediately Roland is not able to really do much anymore. His hands are messed up. He can't hold his guns the same way anymore. And when he's trying to obtain food, it is really hard for him to be able to do it. And he feels like he's not able to provide anymore in the way that he was capable of doing beforehand. But he does end up actually killing a deer, which is the first kind of animal that he's eaten in God knows how long, because with being on this beach for so long, all he's been able to eat are these lobster monstrosities that Eddie had killed, because the meat actually was decently good. Once you like cooked the poison out of the meat, it was good and it was sustainable. But the deer is the first one that they've actually come across in God knows how long. But he can't necessarily cut it all by himself, so Susanna decided to come by and help him out with it, and they eat and they feast. And then Roland has a dream about the tower, the Dark Tower, and he starts to talk to Eddie about it, and Eddie starts getting really concerned, where he's like, I have a distinct feeling basically that neither of us, meaning myself or Susanna, are going to make it, and that you're going to use us as a way to get to the Dark Tower. Are you going to basically sacrifice us for this tower? And Roland doesn't necessarily answer to that. He kind of is just like, I have to do what's necessary. And I don't know what's going to happen. I can't tell you what's going to happen, but he does know that eventually he may have to sacrifice one or both of them in order to get to the Dark Tower, because essentially, as we know, the Dark Tower is the thing he's been going for this whole time. He believes it's his purpose to go to the Dark Tower and figure out what's going on with it, and either destroy who's ever there that is causing these things to change in the way that Roland is not capable of understanding, or, I don't know, take it over. We don't really know. We have no idea what his main purpose is with the Dark Tower still, because it's just been a mystery. We just know that he's been traveling to the Dark Tower looking for answers for something that's happened, and he hasn't gotten them yet. And I think that that's, for a lot of people, that would be what would be the most frustrating part of this series, but I find it still very intriguing because we start to learn bits and pieces of things as we go. Let's go into my overall thoughts on this really quick. So I really liked this one. Again, I'm giving it a 4-star, just like I did with The Gunslinger, because nothing about this screamed absolutely fantastic. I couldn't live without this kind of thing, but I really did enjoy this. I think more so than I did The Gunslinger. The reason being, I think that with the way that all of the characters were introduced, Eddie, Odetta, Detta, and Jack, the drawing of those three characters, I really liked the way it was done. I felt like it was done really well, and it was just very fun to see this kind of blossom. I think even the writing style was much different in terms of the way that the Gunslinger had gone versus this one, because I think that the writing somehow was just a lot crisper, a lot cleaner, and it made it a lot easier for us to be able to follow along with what was going on. And a lot of that having been placed in times that were a little bit more, I don't know, grounded, I guess, was really helpful with that too. Sorry if the angle has changed slightly. I had to replace my battery. So what else I really liked about this, I think, was basically the fact that I just felt like I got much more grounded in the story. Now, mind you, we didn't do much in terms of travel other than with finding the 3 doors along this beach, but I really liked that point because with the Gunslinger, I felt like there was so much travel involved that I kind of lost myself in what exactly was happening. The most I really knew of what exactly was happening was the fact that obviously, like, there were certain important points that were hit where, like, we learned first about Roland and Tall and all these things, and then when he finds Jake, and then traveling with Jake, like when they come across, you know, certain things, and then obviously with the Man in Black at the very end going through and telling him, you know, what's to come, specifically what's to come with this one in terms of the 3 people he's going to be meeting. Now with this one, like I said, I think that the fact that the 3 characters that were drawn from their particular versions of New York City, because those settings were so much more grounded and were less fantastical about them, I think that that really lent itself a lot to the story because it made it so that the story was easier to get enthralled in. It was easier for me to really understand, and also I think in a lot of ways connect with these characters. Like with Eddie, for instance, having been a very troubled individual that was a heroin addict, you know, it made it so much more relatable in a sense. Not relatable in the sense that, like, I know what it's like to be a heroin addict or anything, but relatable in the fact that basically, like, he was more human. He was very much somebody you could see as an actual living, breathing human person in today's society of any kind, even though he was from the 80s. And even with Odetta and Detta bringing in this whole idea of what we now call DID, her whole thing was actually really interesting to read about because the fact that she had no idea that she had this alter and the alter didn't know that there was another person involved in this same headspace was very interesting because for many people with DID before they're diagnosed, they have no idea that this is what's happening to them. They have no idea that the blackouts they experience and the loss of time that they have between days and, like, what exactly happened in that time while being taken over by an alter. Before they're diagnosed, people with DID have no true answers as to how any of that's happening. They just think that they've been asleep for a few days and that it happens, you know, more often than with a normal individual, quote unquote normal. And then with Jack, we have this character who is just downright to the core a bad guy. Like, we don't want really anything to do with him, especially when we realize that he's the reason that Jake even got involved with Roland in the first place. But you also see him as, like, a really interesting puppet, and I think that, like, having a lot of these more grounded aspects with these characters and making them kind of more fleshed out real people in some capacity, it made it much more interesting, and I think made the story a lot easier to digest and have fun with. I was really nervous with reading the second installment because I thought that starting off with the second installment of this series, it was going to be a lot harder for me to really get involved. I thought that with the second book, it was going to make it so very difficult for me to enjoy what was going on, understand what was going on, let alone be able to grasp anything about what this world is and, like, everything. But I think that because we didn't spend so much time in this other world that Roland is currently a part of, and we spend more time in, like, what we would consider our world, it made it a lot more easier to go into and understand what's happening. And I say the same for what's going to happen in the Wastelands. No, I have no idea. I have, if anything, more of an inkling that it's going to revolve more around the world that they're currently in, and I'm going to probably get a little bit more lost because that world kind of gets all kinds of crazy every now and then. But I'm still excited nonetheless because, especially since this book ends with not only having Eddie involved in it still, but then Susanna, or the newer version of Odetta and Detta, you know, I'm really excited to see specifically how Susanna goes about this life and how exactly her personality becomes involved with all these things, and, like, how does she fare in terms of comparing her between how Odetta and Detta were. Like, is she completely a new person, or is she, like I said before, more of an amalgamation of the two personalities that are now whole, and she's just kind of her own new person because of it? I'm really curious, I think, to see that aspect. And then I don't know if we're going to learn much more about what the Dark Tower is going to be. I have a feeling we're going to learn more in terms of like the other tarot cards that the Man in Black had shown Roland in the end of the Gunslinger. I think we're going to see more of that come in again into the Wastelands, but I think that most of the tarot cards thing was involved with this one because it specifically involved 3 of the cards that were involved, which were the Prisoner, which was Eddie, the Lady of Shadows, which was Odetta, Detta, Susanna, whatever you want to call her, and then the Pusher, which was Jack. So I have a feeling that they're going to still place something into this, but not nearly as much as how this book was, with bringing in the 3 people, the drawing of the 3 people that needed to be involved in this story in order to progress basically this plot and progress the overall journey that Roland was on. And now that Roland's, I think, actually starting to feel a lot better, and he's getting a better handle on the fact that he's a handicapped individual, I'm curious to see how then from there, as a handicapped individual, he progresses. In the afterword, all that's said about how the Wasteland goes is that it details half the quest of Roland, Eddie, and Susanna to reach the tower. And then the 4th book, which is called Wizard and Glass, tells of an enchantment and a seduction, but mostly of those things which befell Roland before his readers first met him upon the trail of the Man in Black. So Wizard and Glass is kind of not necessarily a prequel, but it's going to involve a lot of backtracking into Roland's past before he went upon the trail of the Man in Black. So in Wizard and Glass, what we're going to probably see is they're going to go on the journey as normal, but we're going to get a lot of backtracking in terms of leading up to the Man in Black's actual appearance in Roland's life and kind of see what exactly happens, because we do know already that the Man in Black did play a role in Roland's life twice. He came in as a man named Martin who essentially had seduced his mother into an affair, and there's a lot that's kind of divulged from that, but we also know that the Man in Black had disguised himself as a man called Walter O'Dim, who was, I believe, some kind of a mentor to Roland. So I'm interested to see if we're going to go that far, where we're going to see when Martin comes in and what he does, and then if we see what happens when Walter comes in, because there's a lot that's wrapped up in all of that I think is the reason why Roland is so hell-bent on at first finding the Man in Black in the Gunslinger, but now knowing that in the Gunslinger the Man in Black basically disappears or dies or something, and we see the whole thing progress. Now I wonder if he's gonna figure out, like, we're gonna start seeing why exactly the Dark Tower is something he is so hell-bent on finding as well, because if the 2 things are brought up in the same book, you know, we might by book 4 actually start figuring out what the hell he's going for, why he's going to find this Dark Tower, what's the purpose of it, what's the purpose of the Dark Tower in terms of Roland's life, because all we do know of the Dark Tower at this point is that it's a connecting point of several worlds. It is something that is basically the foundation of all of the universes, all of the worlds that we know and don't even know at this point. And so I'm curious to see with Wizard and Glass then, are we going to learn about what exactly led up to Roland understanding what the Dark Tower is and figuring out, like, what is his plan, why he's going to the Dark Tower? I don't know, we're going to have to obviously see, but I'm really excited to read The Wastelands first, which is going to be the first half of the quest going to the Dark Tower. So I'm not sure, like, what to expect in terms of how that story is going to go, but I will be reading the synopsis that's on the back of the book when I go to make that reading vlog. Let me know what you guys thought, though, of the Drawing of 3. If you have read it yourself, if you're reading this series with me, you know, let me know how you guys are thinking of the series. Like, do you like it? Do you not like it? Tell me some reasons why. What are your theories in terms of what's going to be happening here in the next several books? But that's all for me for right now, guys. Thank you all so much for joining me. If you guys did enjoy this video, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already and you'd like to be and would like to see more videos like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.